Welcome back to Kubernetes Crashcasts. I'm Shayla, and I'm here with Victor to dive deeper into the world of Kubernetes. Before we start, I'd like to remind our listeners to rate our podcast on whatever platform you're listening to us. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more people interested in Kubernetes. Today, we're continuing our discussion on pods, focusing on the pod lifecycle. But first, let's start with a quiz question. Victor, would you like to do the honors?
Certainly, Sheila. Here's a question for our listeners. In the pod lifecycle, what phase is a pod in when it has been accepted by the Kubernetes cluster, but one or more of its containers has not been set up and made ready to run? Think about it, and we'll reveal the answer at the end of the episode.
That's an intriguing question, Victor. It really makes you think about the different stages a pod goes through. Before we dive into the answer, let's start by explaining what we mean by pod lifecycle. Victor, could you give us an overview?
Of course, Sheila. The pod lifecycle refers to the series of stages a pod goes through from the moment it's created until it's terminated. It's similar to the life cycle of a living organism: birth, growth, and eventually death. Understanding this life cycle is crucial for managing applications in Kubernetes effectively.
That's a great analogy, Victor. So, if we think of a pod as a living organism, what would be the main stages of its life?
Great question, Sheila. The main stages of a pod's life cycle can be broken down into 5 phases: pending, running, succeeded, failed, and unknown. Let's start with the pending phase. This is like the gestation period for our pod organism. The pod has been accepted by the Kubernetes cluster, but one or more of its containers are not yet ready to run.
Interesting. So, in the pending phase, the pod exists, but isn't fully operational yet. What happens next?
Once all the containers within the pod are created, and at least one container starts running, the pod enters the running phase. This is like the active life of our organism. The pod is now doing its job, whether that's serving a web application, processing data, or whatever task it's been assigned.
I see, but not all pods run indefinitely, right? What happens when a pod completes its task?
Correct, Sheila. When a pod has completed its task and all its containers have terminated successfully, it enters the succeeded phase. Think of this as a peaceful retirement for our pod organism. On the other hand, if one or more containers in the pod have terminated with failure, the pod enters the failed phase. This is like our organism falling ill and not recovering.
That makes sense. And what about the unknown phase you mentioned earlier?
The unknown phase occurs when the state of the pod can't be determined, usually due to communication errors with the node where the pod is running. It's like losing contact with our organism. We know it exists, but we're not sure about its current state.
I see. This life cycle seems quite complex. Are there any common misunderstandings about how pods move through these phases?
Absolutely, Sheila. One common misconception is that once a pod enters the running phase, it will stay there until it's manually terminated. In reality, pods can cycle through these phases multiple times due to various factors like node failures, resource constraints, or application crashes. It's important to design applications with this in mind.
That's a great point, Victor. It reminds me of the importance of resilience in distributed systems. Now, you mentioned containers earlier. How do container states relate to the pod life cycle?
Excellent question, Sheila. While pods have phases, the containers within them have their own states: waiting, running, and terminated. These states are more granular and can help diagnose issues within a pod. For example, a pod might be in the running phase, but one of its containers could be in the waiting state due to an image pull error.
I see. So monitoring both pod phases and container states is crucial for understanding what's happening in our cluster. Are there any tools or commands that can help us observe these states?
Absolutely. The Kubernetes describe pod command is your best friend here. It provides detailed information about a pod, including its current phase, container states, and recent events. For a more real-time view, Kubernetes get pods, W, will watch for changes in pod status.
That's really helpful, Victor. Now, I've heard about something called pod conditions. How do these fit into the life cycle?
Great question, Sheila. Pod conditions are a set of Boolean flags that describe the current state of the pod. There are 4 standard conditions: pod scheduled, initialized, containers ready, and ready. These conditions provide more detailed information about the pod's state within its current phase. For example, a pod might be in the running phase, but if its ready condition is false, it may not be able to serve traffic yet.
That's fascinating. It seems like there are multiple layers of status information we can use to understand a pod's state. Now, what happens if a container in a pod fails? Does the whole pod get recreated?
That depends on the pod's restart policy, Sheila. Kubernetes supports 3 restart policies: always, on failure, and never. The default is always, which means Kubernetes will always try to restart failed containers. This is crucial for maintaining the desired state of your application. However, it's important to note that this doesn't create a new pod. It restarts the containers within the existing pod.
I see. So the restart policy helps with the resilience of our applications. Are there any other mechanisms that help ensure our pods are healthy and ready to serve traffic?
Absolutely, Sheila. This is where probes come in. Kubernetes supports 3 types of probes: liveness, readiness, and startup probes. Liveness probes check if a container is still running and restart it if it's not. Readiness probes determine if a container is ready to serve traffic. Startup probes give applications time to start up before other probes kick in. These probes are crucial for maintaining the health and availability of your applications.
Wow, Victor. There's so much to consider in the pod lifecycle. It seems like understanding these concepts is crucial for effectively managing applications in Kubernetes. Before we wrap up, could you share a real-world scenario where understanding the pod lifecycle made a big difference?
Certainly, Sheila. I once worked on a project where we had a critical microservice that kept crashing and restarting. By closely monitoring the pod lifecycle and container states, we discovered that the application was running out of memory during peak loads. This insight allowed us to adjust our resource allocation and implement better error handling, significantly improving the stability of our service.
That's a great example, Victor. It really illustrates the practical importance of these concepts. Now, I think it's time to reveal the answer to our quiz question. Victor, would you like to do the honors?
Of course, Sheila. The answer to our quiz question is pending. When a pod has been accepted by the Kubernetes cluster, but one or more of its containers has not been set up and made ready to run, the pod is in the pending phase.
Thank you, Victor. To summarize today's episode, we've explored the pod lifecycle, including the 5 main phases: pending, running, succeeded, failed, and unknown. We've also discussed container states, pod conditions, restart policies, and probes. Understanding these concepts is crucial for effectively managing and troubleshooting applications in Kubernetes. Before we sign off, I'd like to remind our listeners to visit crashcasts.com and join our Discord community. Your support and engagement mean the world to us. If you're enjoying the show, please consider supporting us on Patreon. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on your preferred platform. Until next time, keep crashing through Kubernetes.